that Fitzharris tried in some places to tell some stories of patients where I think that they were often unheard. So there's a good question in the chat that I think is a fun one and maybe worth mentioning here, and it is about how frequently leeches were used as as an intervention. And this participant asks, how long were leeches commonly used? Do you know the answer to that question?
Forever and forever. Yeah, I mean, so the humoral theory of medicine, which is what that idea is based on, you have these four humors in the body that become out of balance when you have too much yellow bile or not enough blood in your system, or you know the wrong amount of phlegm, like you're imbalanced, and in order to bring the body back into balance and restore health to the patient, you have to kind of
Right,
restore
the
the
book talked
balance.
about sweet pus versus sour pus,
Right.
which like so pleasant.
Yeah, but so so you use things like purging, emetics, blistering and thing. And so bloodletting, leeches were one way of doing that. If you have too much blood, you got to get rid of it. Leeches will help you out. But they had other terrifying devices that were used to make you bleed more efficiently. That idea took a really long time to die, even after other theories of disease kind of came to the forefront. And even after the germ theory, there were still, doctors who clung to that. But it is, I mean, there are reasons to use leeches still today, and they are still, maggots are used as well, because when you have like a decaying wound, the maggots will eat the dead flesh and leave the healthy flesh. So you still find them in hospitals. It's fun.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And there's lots of really good comments in the chat. Thanks, y'all. One of the things I love about this community is that we all come with lots of really good background and experience on some of these topics. So, really good stuff there. So, Sarah, I want to talk a little bit about a little bit more about the History Museum and specifically kind of the first medical school experience, right? Because that's one of the things that Lister, we get a lot of time for him in the school experience. And he's kind of an interesting student because he comes with a microscope and no one else comes, thinks about this technology. So I was thinking about the timing here, and I think I have this right that Lister went to medical school in 1848, right? And the first medical school here in Indiana started, you can quiz me on my IU history, I think in 1903 or 1913. Um,
You're
so
close.
what's similar? Am I wrong?
You're wrong. Yeah. IU started in 1903, but the
Okay.
first medical school was about 1840. It was very short lived. It opened in LaPorte, Indiana. And then over the next few decades, there were a lot of small schools that popped up here and there. They would come and go all over the state. And then there were three. These were all small proprietary schools.
This
Um,
is so interesting. So it was like sort of the wild, wild west, like because I was thinking about this as it related to like hearing all the hospitals in London, and there was a lot of competition for things.
mhm. Not so much here. There weren't that many of them, but they did exist. But so 1903 is when three of the larger proprietary schools merged and became what we know as IU School of Medicine. But even though the others were around, a lot of doctors, that's not how they learned to practice. In Indiana, the predominant form of medical education was still the apprenticeship system until well into the 19th century. So, it wasn't required that a doctor get a degree of any kind in order to practice medicine in Indiana until the late 19, or 1880s. And
Got
so
it.
there
Got
were a
it.
lot of people who learned by becoming an apprentice.
And so I like the apprentice model made sense to me, and I knew a little bit about that history here in Indiana. Were there other similarities between kind of what a medical school experience would be like here in Indiana during that time in comparison to what Lister experienced?
Well, they were a lot smaller. There were some similarities. By the time Lister was in medical school, the Anatomy Act in England had been passed, and so I don't believe he ever went into a graveyard to dig up his own cadaver. Whereas in Indiana, we didn't have an anatomical board until 1903. Um, So, body snatching was one big difference during his time. I think the scale maybe was a lot different. Schools in Indiana were very small. They were almost like diploma mills in a lot of cases. They frequently would like start up and last, 5 years, 10 years maybe, and then they would, fizzle out and another school would open. Um, the the curriculum wasn't standardized across the country. It wasn't regulated really in any way. Um, so your experience depended on the school you went to, but it was a lot of sitting in lectures and maybe helping out a doctor in his office, similar to an apprenticeship where you would follow your mentor around and kind of help him and watch what he's doing, and if he has any medical books, you'd read those if he if you were so lucky. um, and then when he felt you were a doctor, you would just declare yourself a doctor and set up shop. But so it's a little different in some ways, and then not so much in other ways. But a lot of physicians, students in the state graduated with very little practical knowledge or experience. Um, it, it was kind of a mixed bag. A lot of doctors went on to other medical schools outside of the state. In larger cities on the East Coast, there were more kind of advanced programs. You know, you had more specialists and more sort of differing opinions to draw from.
So one of the participants mentioned, and I wonder if you can talk about this a little bit, was the idea that early medical schools didn't have any laboratories or anatomy classes. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what, I mean, I know that when we go to the Medical History Museum, we have a chance to see the classroom, right? So tell us a little bit about what the space is like.
Well, that's one of the things that was so great about the pathological department when it opened. Educating medical students was a big part of its mission. They were looking for physical causes of mental diseases with the hopes of finding treatments or even preventing them, but they were also using it as a teaching opportunity for students. So they had relationships with medical schools, and then after IU School of Medicine kind of emerged as the leader, it was pretty much exclusively them until about 1956. But they had these relationships. There were people who worked at the hospital who also worked at the med school, and so they would have students out for lectures in psychiatry and neurology. They would view autopsies there. Autopsies were done, as frequently as they could on patients to kind of learn more about what was going on with their central nervous system. Um, so there were opportunities later on, even before the anatomical laws were passed in Indiana. There were requirements actually that medical students do some form of dissection in order to graduate. The problem was there weren't very many legal sources of the bodies, and so that was one of the arguments that the doctors and administrators made. We're required to give the students this experience, and it's a valuable experience, but we can't legally do that, and so we're going to lose these folks. They're going to go to medical school in Illinois or somewhere else, and they're not going to come back. And it took them a long time to convince the state, even after President Harrison's father's body was stolen. The state legislature wasn't convinced that we needed laws. So, of course, that
That's
happened in
very
Cincinnati, but
that's very interesting to think of. We think that all the politicians have a lot of power in those contexts. Maybe that's not necessarily the case.
well, I don't think he had been president yet at that time. This is 1878, so he would have been, prominent for sure.
Right,
But
right. Still a politician, but yeah, yeah. So let's I want to make sure that we pause and I'm just going to check the chat to see it. There's lots of great conversation, but I just want to make sure that I haven't missed any good questions in here. Again, if you have questions for Sarah, you're welcome to use the chat. I'll try to keep those cataloged as we go on. Um, I would love to hear some of the conversation or hear maybe a report out from a couple of conversations from the small groups. So that original question was really about those kind of inequities that we face in the system that maybe still persist. Did any group have a conversation that folks might be willing to sort of share how their conversation went? Either you can do it in the chat and I'll read it, or you're welcome to turn on your mic and camera, and I would be happy to hear from you. Go ahead, Hannah. How are you?
Hi, good. How are you?
Good.
So we brought up a couple things. Someone actually did talk about the Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks, and we were talking a bit about how certain marginalized groups are still distrustful to this day of the healthcare system. And really, when you think about that, that has a lot of groups. It's political injustice, lack of access to healthcare, but then even going back farther to back when surgeons didn't use anesthesia, and you were really more likely to survive if you didn't go to the hospital because they didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for sharing that from your group. It sounds like it was an interesting conversation. As we were talking, one of the things I was thinking about, I read a story, it might have been in the New York Times. Somebody could maybe find it and correct me if I'm wrong. I should really look these things up before I start this conversation. A few years ago, that talked about the number of physicians who die at home without significant medical intervention, and how much higher that percentage is than the general population. Bree is nodding, so that makes me feel better, like I know what I'm talking about. Thanks, Bree. Um, I think that that's one of the things that we see, right? And when we're talking about inequities, is about kind of, if you have access to knowledge, that can allow you to make different kinds of decisions about your care. And so I think, Hannah, it sounds like your group really dug into that a little bit. And there's lots of good conversation in the chat. Leah says that her group talked about race and gender and its effect on pain treatment and access to health insurance, which is one of the things that Sarah and I talked about, or varying levels of insurance and how that can shape the type of care you receive. And I think that that's one of the things that's really powerful. So I've got another turn and talk question for us. I'm looking at the time, and I know you guys love to talk to each other. So here's our next turn and talk question. This is a little bit later on in the book. I love I love to bring quotes to this conversation. So, earlier in the book, Fitzharris talks about how crass many medical students were with the cadaver lab, or even how intense some of Lister's predecessors were with their patients, right? Tracking the guy down in the closet, um, which is different than many other surgeons at the time. Lister actually seems genuinely empathetic. And this is a quote from the book. Lister understood that being in a hospital could be a terrifying experience and followed his golden rule. Every patient, even the most degraded, should be treated with the same care and regard as though he were the Prince of Wales himself. And there's that touching story in the book, if you got this far, that is about a little girl that comes with her doll, and she says that her doll is sick, and he like treats her doll as well as treating her. Um, so my question is, Lister's obviously trying to sell an idea to the medical establishment that is not particularly um, welcoming to this new idea that he's bringing. And so my question is, do you think that Lister's more empathetic and patient-centered attitude helped him or hurt him in convincing others about germ theory and antiseptic? So Leah's like so angry that I have the longest question ever. Sorry, Leah. The question is, do you think that Lister's more empathetic attitude helped him or hurt him in convincing other physicians primarily about germ theory? Look at Leah's outstanding. So question for you is in the chat if you want to copy and paste it and use it as you head into your breakout rooms. And I think I'll probably send you to the same rooms. Let's see if I can figure that out. I'll give you a few minutes and we'll come back and we'll chat together. All right. Let's see how we did here. If you don't see your breakout room, check your windows. It might be hidden behind another window for you, but everyone should see a breakout room and have a chance to join. And if you're hanging out here in the main room, you're hanging out with Sarah and me and Rufus. who's helping us make sure that we're connected. And so Nick, Jay, Nancy, Chad, Amy, let me know if y'all want to join a room. I think I've assigned everybody. So I think we should be good to go. There we go. Very good. And remember, if you don't join a breakout room, then somebody somewhere doesn't have enough partners. Okay. So Sarah, what do you think? Do you think that his sort of empathy, do you think it helped him or hurt him in being convincing of his colleagues?
Um, well, first I would say that I'm reluctant to say that the other doctors didn't have empathy. Some of them were real jerks for sure. Some of them were downright creepy. But I think for a lot of them, they were trying to overcome this, well, like a repugnance on some level of kind of what they're doing, and this kind of, there's an emotional toll that this takes. Imagine you know that you have to amputate this guy's leg or he's definitely going to die. But if you remove the leg, then he's got a better shot at living. So you know that, and you know you need to do that. And you have like this guy laying in front of you, and you've got several assistants maybe holding him down. Maybe he had a shot of whiskey, but he's still terrified. He still
Yeah.
feels everything that's happening to him. He's fighting against it. Um, and I think, like, if it were me causing that fear and pain, I think that would be a difficult thing for a lot of people. And so, we talk about clinical detachment now, and I think that's important on some level. I think it can go too far, and I think maybe the doctors in Lister's time maybe weren't so well equipped to deal with that. But I would just be reluctant to say that they were not empathetic. It might be that they were looking at the patient the way they needed to be able to get the job done.
That's a
But
really good point, that's a pretty harsh characterization. I think you're right. I mean, I think that, and that's something I feel like that comes through a lot of Fitzharris's book, right? Is the idea that this profession takes an incredible physical toll and an incredible like time after time, you're trying to treat a patient and they pass away. And so that would you would end up feeling a lot of futility in the work.
right, right. But then I also think, in terms of whether his empathy, which he clearly was an empathetic person, whether that hurt him or not. I mean, I think ultimately, he was a good doctor. He had a good bedside manner. His patients liked him. His students adored him. And I think that says a lot. But those weren't the people that he had to convince. Convincing the students did help him in the end because they
Sure.
grew up, his sort of disciples, and spread the word, so to speak.
He
So
has
that
like
was
that made me think of, like, marketing companies sometimes call it a street team now, like, like it made me think of like there was like a Lister street team, they were printing t-shirts.
I
Right.
have
Yeah.
certain. Um, but it was the other people in the medical profession, and particularly the older doctors, who he had to convince. And I'm not sure whether his empathy had anything to do with that. I think he was eventually successful in ways that someone like Semmelweis couldn't have been for a number of reasons, and none of those had anything to do with any kind of lack of empathy on or extraordinary empathy either way on his part. He had some communication issues. He had kind of a faulty, like a faulty proposal, so to speak. He was an unpleasant person to be around, though he was nice. He was difficult, and so I feel like maybe there are other qualities of Lister other than that empathy that would have helped or hurt
That would have helped kind of balance it out.
him.
Yeah,
Right.
I think to some extent you're right. I mean, I think about Semmelweis, who obviously also
God love him.
features in the book, right? And it's interesting. I watched in preparation for this, watched like a talk that Lindsay Fitzharris gave at the Smithsonian a couple of years ago, and she was talking about like she just sort of mentioned it in passing, but then I did a little bit of a little bit of research that there's like that Semmelweis has gotten like a little resurgence in the past few years. Like
Mm,
people really like kind of hang on to his story as one that is
yeah,
kind of an underdog sort of story.
but I don't like. I
And
think he
and I know that
failed for a
you
very
have a perspective about that.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, like he wasn't like nobody even knew who he was until about 1966. There was a historian who published an article about him, and then suddenly the world knew about him. In the 70s, his body was exhumed. They were moving him to another cemetery, and so they thought, well,
Really?
let's do an autopsy because there was all this controversial surrounding his death. You know, he'd
Right.
been institutionalized. There were conspiracy theories that kind of came out of like some photocopies of medical and autopsy records from the asylum where he died, and the guy that sort of published them did a lot to kind of sensationalize it. But yeah, people either like I think they you either totally understand why he failed. You can sympathize with him, but you can also understand why nobody would even want to have a conversation with him about it, much less like accept his ideas.
Right.
Um, he also didn't have, and I don't know if maybe you want to talk about this, another time, but the way he presented his theory was very different, and the theory itself, his ideas were very different in a lot of like practical ways than Lister's, which made it hard for anybody to accept them.
That's a really good point. That's one of the I actually tell a Semmelweis, well, sort of a Semmelweis story in my science communication class when we're talking about sort of data storytelling, like how can you use data to tell a particular story. And this article that my students read, it's kind of a historiography piece. It's probably not very good, but it does make my point well. That is that is essentially that part of the problem was that he just didn't do a good job of explaining what he was,
And he didn't
what
try.
right, right,
He
exactly.
didn't try. When anytime anyone had an objection, he would simply argue with them and get mad. He would write a nasty open letter and publish it somewhere, calling people murderers and irresponsible, and instead of addressing the objections that people had, he
And
would lash
so
out.
in that way, maybe Lister's empathy was helpful. What it's not like because then at least he can read
I
his
guess I see
audience.
that more as like a lack of like just an enormous lack of people skills. I guess. Maybe it was deeper than that, though. I guess I never thought of him as a person who lacks empathy, just as a person who can't communicate with people. Maybe it was that he couldn't relate at all. Maybe it was that. I always felt like he was just so like he just clung to his work so desperately that he just couldn't function.
So
And long before he was institutionalized, he had like these deep personality flaws
that
that
made it really
everybody
hard, I'm
thought,
sure, for people to
yeah,
get on to be on his street team. Again, no one
right.
was printing Semmelweis T-shirts.
Right. You couldn't like how can you take someone seriously or really consider like their theory, which I would argue that his wasn't even a theory really. He just said wash your hands, here's what I've noticed. He didn't have like that underlying scientific theory behind it to kind of explain why it worked. And Lister's was like a whole system of different practices that kind of all work together, and he presented them in a way that scientists recognized as like science.
As more
um,
systematic, right.
right. But at any rate, yeah, I guess I always thought of him as just like an unreasonable sort of person who just felt like he should be believed regardless, and wasn't willing to really have difficult conversations.
Yeah.
And when
Isn't
people
that interesting? I think that probably happens even today.
Right, right. I think about the way Lister reacted when James Simpson, who was at first operating under kind of a pseudonym, had published, that piece kind of railing against him, and pointing out all the things he thought were wrong with the theory, and then saying you didn't develop this, and the way Lister handled that versus the way Semmelweis handled anything that ever happened to him. So,
Right, yes, it's a very different a very different story to
right,
that
right.
point. Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're
Just
right.
as compelling, I think. I think Semmelweis' story would make a great book too. It'd certainly be a lot more dramatic.
Yes, that's true. That's absolutely true. Um, All right. So let's see here. We will head back. I think everybody's back from their breakouts or on their way back. Thank you all. I hope you had a great conversation. So as usual, we will, I'll ask Sarah to talk a little bit about her thoughts on the turn and talk question, and then I'll get some feedback from all of you about how the conversations went. So Sarah, we had the question again for those who kind of wanted to hear it was Lister's more empathetic and patient-centered attitude helpful or hurtful in helping people, particularly his colleagues, accept his theories, particularly related to germ theory? And Sarah, we had a lot of conversation around sort of contrasting some of Lister's communication style versus Semmelweis's communication style. And for those that have just joined us, I mentioned to Sarah, if you're interested in learning more, Lindsay Fitzharris did a talk in 2017 for the Smithsonian Institute. And that talk is available on C-SPAN, so you can get it for free online. And she was talking about the idea that Semmelweis, as a sort of historical character, has had a kind of recent resurgence. Like there's a bunch of people that have kind of rallied around him. And Sarah, I know that you have kind of some thoughts about what it was actually that made Lister successful in sort of getting folks on board, and maybe what Semmelweis was not able to do. So I'll let you comment on those things.
So there's just a kind of a deep contrast between the two men and how they presented their thoughts and how they responded to criticism, and even in the ways that they kind of outlined their theories. You know, Lister spent years studying and experimenting and documenting, and he not only did he develop this whole system of practices that kind of work together, but he also, you know, pulling from Pasteur's germ theory, kind of had this scientific explanation of how he came to this, how he felt it worked, kind of to explain, you know, not only do I think you should wash your hands, and not only have I observed that it's helpful, you know, or not only have I observed that using carbolic acid on an open wound to prevent infection is useful, but also here's this kind of underlying scientific theory about why that is. With Semmelweis, so I don't think you get a great sense of who he was in the book. His story is complicated and sometimes a little bit humorous, depending on your sense of humor. But the book isn't about him, right? So you just don't get that sense. But he worked in a hospital in Vienna that had two maternity wards. You know, we all know the story. You know, one's run by the physicians, one's run by the midwives. He notices that the women whose deliveries were assisted by a physician were significantly more likely to die from infection than the women who gave birth with assistance from midwives. And so he sets out to find out why. And he kind of you know, he doesn't publish in journals and things like that immediately. What he did was kind of he sort of instituted this policy in the hospital that required everybody to wash their hands with carbolic lime after they did an autopsy or before they assisted with a birth. And you know, he didn't really have an explanation as to why it worked. You know, a lot of doctors debated about the nature of disease and how diseases originate and spread and all of that. There was kind of a wide variety of feelings on the topic, and he didn't try to like bring people together with a theory. He just said, you know, wash your hands. And you know, it seems like a no-brainer to us that we have that kind of person knowledge, right? Where we know what we know, and we can't unknow it. We can't imagine not knowing it, that sort of thing. But you know, with Semmelweis, you know, he met resistance just like Lister did, but the way that he responded to it made him kind of unapproachable. So he would lash out at people who disagreed with him, if people criticized or objected to particular aspects of his idea. Instead of addressing those, he would write these nasty public letters, calling people names and attacking them, instead of really addressing like their concerns. And so nobody wants to have a conversation with someone like that, right? Like nobody wants to give that guy a fair hearing. So it never went anywhere, and he was pretty much forgotten. After he died in 1865, nobody remembered him. Like, Dr. Fitzharris even mentioned when Lister went to that hospital and talked about his methods, and nobody even mentioned Semmelweis or his work. Like, he was completely forgotten until about the mid 1960s. And so he just he had some deep personality flaws. He was not an easy man to work with. He was generally considered to be like an upright citizen. He was thought to be a good person, but he just didn't have the communication skills that Lister had, and he didn't have the ability to address or respond to criticism the way Lister did, and so nobody listened to him.
And so, what do you think about Lister's message? You kind of referred to it a little bit. Was particularly convincing. I mean, because to some extent, he really was able to change. I mean, despite some of the resistance he faced, a lot of folks did change their behavior. So, what do you think about Lister's message that was more effective?
It was more broad. It was like I said, it was more of a system. So it was like this whole system of practices, and he continued to develop it over time, which I think was important too. He didn't just make this statement and publish it and then keep publishing the same thing over and over again until he was institutionalized. He he developed his system over time and built on what he already had discovered, but he also had pulled from Pasteur's germ theory. So he had sort of this underlying scientific theory to kind of back him up and explain what was going on. So he had all of his research and studies, he had all the data to show that it worked, and then he had this underlying theory to explain how it worked or why it worked. And I think that just made it more convincing for a lot of people.
Yeah, particularly physicians and those who were starting to sort of see themselves as scientists, right? I mean, I know physicians at the time didn't fully see themselves as scientists, but I think as that transition, again, because we're going sort of from, Victorian to the more progressive era, we see that sort of shift in thinking that there's science behind this, and that helps to shape how we understand these issues. So I would love to hear from some of the folks in your turn and talk conversations. What did you think about this question? Why do you think it was that, was it, or my question was, let's go, let me see here. There it is. Do you think that Lister's more empathetic attitude helped him or hurt him in convincing others about his ideas about antiseptic and germ theory? And if you have ideas, you're welcome to turn on your mic and camera, and we're happy to take them there, or if you can put them in the chat. Oh, go ahead, Hannah.
All right. So I think what was the comparison between Lister and Semmelweis is really interesting. Our group kind of concluded that Lister's empathy definitely helped him with his medical students and infusing his ideas to them. And certainly, of course, it helped with his patients trusting and admiring him, but probably not so much in convincing the medical community. It was probably more convincing the medical community in how carefully methodical and scientific he was. He did these replicable experiments. He kept improving. He built on the work of other people like Pasteur and his germ theory. And then also eventually other physicians started replicating his work, and they were replicating it actually properly and consistently, not so much like with Semmelweis. And then they started adding their observations and saying, hey, we replicated this and we can show that it works.
Yeah, that's a great point. That as that sort of thought process, that sort of scientific thought process develops, because others can replicate it, I think that is, that becomes sort of the gold standard then that we start to use for what makes convincing evidence. That's a really good point. Was there another group that had a conversation that's maybe worth mentioning here? How did you talk about this, about whether or not sort of his empathetic attitude was helpful or maybe diminish his ability to persuade? I hear somebody turn on their mic, but I can't see who it is, so go ahead.
It's me.
Hi, Jen.
Hi. So we mentioned they talk about it kind of in the beginning of this book, and for anybody who read the book about organ donation with us, they mentioned it this as well. But probably something that didn't help, because a lot of people are really bad at being able to do this, is they said for surgery, especially before you could have things like chloroform to knock people out, you had to get rid of empathy, right? They said you have to ignore the screams. And in the organ donation book, they talk about how you have to kind of turn off that switch that connects you to a person, because you have to get in there and do your job. And if you're too emotional about it, you can't do it. So I think one of the reasons he probably got a lot of pushback from surgeons, because they'd only fairly recently gotten over the whole pain problem, was this idea that it's impossible to turn off the empathy while you're cutting someone and then turn it back on once they're okay and checking in on them. So that probably didn't help him for the medical professions. But we also talked about, like what Hannah was saying, that when you're a patient and your doctor really shows that you care, you really listen to them, and you're really more willing to spread the news about them. And same with the students. When you see a professor who's really passionate with his work, in this case with his patients, then you're much more likely to listen and to be willing to kind of pass on that passion.
Thanks, Jen. That's a really good summary. And Leah sort of echoes some of that, the particular personalities of surgeons regarding empathy, the ability to cut into a person, right? That is one of the things that we know, that you have to sort of see a person as an object, right? Sort of separate the body from the soul in order to be able to think about those things. Mary Teresa, I see you turned your mic on. Did you want to add something?
Yes, I think that it did help him, and helped him spread the idea of how important it was to follow the techniques that he was discovering and checking on. There's something about a professor, being a doctor or another of medicine, but a professor who is kind to not only the patients, but to its staff and to others, and has a certain sense of decorum. It's not slinging bad words at everybody that doesn't agree with them. And I think that even though there were top surgeons and doctors and who did not totally agree with him for a while, I think that underneath they started to realize that this is a decent guy and maybe he's telling the truth.
Thanks, Mary Teresa. I think that that's a good point, that a lot of what you're saying there is true, that even then, as it is today, practicing medicine is a team sport, right? So you've got to kind of get the whole team, particularly if you're talking about something like infection prevention, you've got to get the whole team on board. So it does make me wonder, and I don't think we hear a ton about, I mean, we hear how his students certainly get on board and support him, but thinking about, and the power differences being what they were at the time, but it makes me think about how those things might be different. So yeah, I appreciate that. I think that that's a good point. All right. So there's a question in the chat that is from Leah, but maybe from someone else as well, and I want to make sure we get to it. What kinds of surgical or medical practices from the period of the museum or path lab, so the Indiana Medical History Museum that you work at, were designed to replace or correct some of the practices that we saw in the book?
You mean like surgical procedures in particular, or?
I think you could start there, but I know that certainly there's lots of equipment at the museum that's designed to sort of change the approach that we're taking to be in some ways more humane.
Well, I mean, it was more of a research lab, so they weren't treating patients there. Patients really wouldn't have been in the building much unless they were passed away. Is Norma still here? She might be able to speak to that better than I could about the actual technology.
Let's see, I'm looking.
Hi, Norma.
Hi, Norma.
Well, one of the things that strikes me, as we talked about whether to have a scientific background or a laboratory background, one thing that they were trying to do at that building was when medical students came through, or the staff, was they were required not just to be in the laboratory and looking at the microscope and doing the research things there, but also the pathologists were supposed to be out on the floor and looking at the patients, which is something that great idea, should have happened, but still really doesn't. Pathologists are like locked away in the basement looking. But that was something that I thought for their, uh, okay, so the building was not a medical school. This was not a medical school, but still the superintendent's intent was to make sure the residents, the new learning students, got both of these aspects very deeply. And that background in laboratory, as I put in my chat, was very much German. The Germans won the war on medical education. You have your years in the undergraduate years of having laboratories and things like that, and your anatomical classes, and then you go on and see patients. So that's one thing that I really love about what the superintendent was doing at the time, was blending the science and the bedside here at Central. Here, I'm here because I live here, Central State.
She's like, I'm here because it's right out the door. You can't see that, but yes, right there. So Norma, what, like, I feel like we get a 2-for-1 tonight. Do you want to tell everybody who you are?
Well, who am I? George Hanlon said I'm the woman around town. My background is clinical laboratory, mostly toxicology and clinical chemistry over time as an analyst in pathology. And I became acquainted with the Medical History Museum, taken a history class for fun at IUPUI, and Phil Scarpino brought our class out here in the 80s. Later on, I had the opportunity then, as life changes, to volunteer, and I started volunteering here. And it is my cradle of my profession, the clinical laboratory. So it's very dear to me for different reasons than some people. Everybody who comes there has a different reason as to why they attach to it. So that's my thing now. And I went back then in 2016 and finished a master's in U.S. history. So I got the best.
Thank you. Yes, Norma is also like super volunteer at the History Museum. We're happy to have you. Thank you for being here tonight. So I want to make sure that we have enough time for you to ask your questions, whether that's of the whole group or of Sarah. So again, there's the chat box if you do not feel comfortable turning on your mic and camera, but we, I think, have been doing all right with camera and mic use. So if you do have a question and you prefer just to ask it out loud, you're welcome to turn on your camera and mic. But if not, I'll monitor the chat. So either way. Go ahead with your question. I can't tell who that is. All right, well, I've got another question for Sarah if we're still waiting here. So Sarah, one of the things that I think is interesting about this book is about how I think that the book is really about like people who are, and this sort of relates to our last question. So this is my bonus question at the bottom of your sheet, Sarah, which is that the butchering art to me is really about people who are on the leading edge of science, trying to push forward a stubborn culture, a stubborn sort of medical culture in which people resist change and sometimes are reluctant to admit their faults. And so my question for you is, in what other ways, given your background in history, particularly again in mental health history, in what other ways has medicine been slow to adapt?
You know, I think there are a lot of ways and a lot of areas of medicine where there's been slow change. This is going to sound weird. I kind of think of medical history in sort of evolutionary terms, where you have sort of these long periods of stasis where there's very slow advancement and things don't really change in any kind of perceptible way. And it's kind of stagnant, but then that's sort of sprinkled with these kind of moments of punctuated equilibrium where there's so much rapid change that, you know, within a generation or two, you have like this whole new kind of species of medicine that emerges. So I think a lot of change is hard to see, and then suddenly things have changed. When I was thinking about this question, what I kept coming back to was a student in our so So in 2015, I worked with Dr. Ashley Inman, who is a pathologist at Ivy School of Medicine, to develop a.
And often a frequenter of Books, Booze, and Brains. I don't
I
think
know
she's here
that.
tonight,
Yeah,
but she's
we'll talk
usually
about
here.
it. But we worked to develop a fourth-year medical rotation for students who are interested in sort of digging deeper into particular areas of medical history. So it's sort of like an independent study where students can choose a topic. It's frequently related to like the specialty that they're going into, or something that they have found interesting or intriguing about medicine that they kind of want to know more about the origins of, or why we do this the way we do, that sort of thing. And they're always incredibly interesting. But I think this was back in February of this year. We had a student who she chose, and sometimes this happens where they choose a topic that sounds not particularly interesting, but then in the end, it's like the most fascinating presentation. So this happened once with a student who, for some reason, that's not entirely clear, developed this interest in the history of chemical containers. And it doesn't sound like that would be like, I don't know, like it doesn't reach out and grab you, you wouldn't think, but it was incredible. So this particular student, she had been thinking for some time already about the it's incentive spirometry. Am I saying that right? Does anyone know? So that's the little handheld device that you blow into this tube, and there's a chamber with like this little piston that shoots up, and it tells you how you're doing. It's used to kind of exercise your lungs, I suppose, to kind of to help you recover from lung surgery or prolonged spirometer. Thank you. Kind of prolonged illness. And I think of it the way I think of like, it's like at the fair where you hit that thing with the big mallet, and then the creeper with the fanny pack either tells you that you're weak or he hits on you, one or the other, maybe both. It's sort of like that, in my mind at least. And they've been used for a long time. There's debate though about how effective they are. And she had wondered previously, why do we do this if we're not entirely sure that it's beneficial? And everyone she talked to was just kind of like, well, that's what we do. It's what we were taught. Everyone else does it, so we do it. And I thought that was intriguing because, blowing on this device, if it's not beneficial, probably isn't doing any harm. But I feel like just the idea of doing something that we don't maybe all agree is effective just because it's always been done is kind of a shocking idea to me. I was shocked by it. And so it just got me thinking, and I don't have any kind of opinion on incentive spirometers or their effectiveness, but it was the whole concept of challenging what you're taught and questioning things was intriguing to me. So I kept thinking that there are things happening in the medical field now that I have no idea about. And I just wondered if there are like medical folks here with us tonight who might have better examples, like, current modern ones. My interest in history ends about 1960. So, it was just what I was thinking. I don't know if that even made any sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, that sometimes the sheer inertia of an idea, right, that we've always done it that way. It's a sort of background approach that we've always taken, that we think, well, this is what stands to reason, so we'll keep doing it. Yeah, there's lots of great conversation in the chat that talks about those things. And I heard that somebody's turned on their mic, so let me I'll go ahead and let the person who turned on their mic and would like to ask a question or make a comment go ahead.
Yeah, this is Mike Rubino. I was just
Hi, Mike.
The one I was going to throw out. We had talked about was the work by Warren and Marshall on the bacteria that caused ulcers, and this would, I think, in the late 80s or 90s, and Marshall actually cultured the Helicobacter pylori, I believe it is. Anyhow, they couldn't convince the existing medical community that ulcers were caused by bacteria. So he drank the culture he had and showed on himself that he developed a severe peptic ulcer and whatnot. So and there was opposition to that. There was a lot of it was from pharmaceutical companies who had invested millions, if not billions of dollars in over-the-counter and some prescribed drugs to treat ulcers, and something, a whole new theory, and that could have really impacted their profits was really opposed. So I mean, that's probably one of the more, I think, the ones I thought of as something fairly recent and fairly substantial that it trying to
Yeah,
change the medical
absolutely.
community.
Great example, Mike. So there was another comment in the chat that I think just went to Leah. So I want to make sure to ask it, and maybe this will be our last comment for the night. If you've got maybe one more comment or question, you can go ahead and put it in the box. We'll try to add it in. So Sarah, we know that a lot of the history of the Indiana Medical History Museum is focused on Central State, on the hospital. And someone asked a question that was about lobotomies and shock treatments, and kind of the history of those, and how those are kind of have been used over time, and whether or not they're still used today. Can you talk a little bit about, because I know that that's an area that the History Museum has really done some deep work into.
Yes, yeah, I am familiar with that history. So beginning in 1939, Central State Hospital introduced Metrozole, insulin, and electric shock therapy. So that's kind of about the time when they were kind of introduced more broadly. Insulin shock treatment and Metrozole shock treatment were discontinued for a time because the side effects were pretty harsh, but ECT has been used ever since then. It's still used to this day. I've talked to patients who have undergone that treatment who like swear by it. It's a little different now. When it was first introduced, you would have patients being held down by sometimes attendants, sometimes fellow patients, and the shock is administered now. I think you're sedated now. It's less traumatic, but it's still used. The lobotomies are a little different. So those became kind of wildly popular in the United States in the 1940s, and the superintendent of the hospital at the time, he had a couple of reasons for making this decision. He kind of questioned the efficacy of it, and he thought that perhaps they were overprescribed. There were a lot of people who were just kind of having their loved ones lobotomized, for misbehaving and things like that. There are stories you hear about, like, angry stepmothers and their 12-year-old stepson in for a lobotomy. So he banned them on the hospital grounds. They were never performed at Central State Hospital, and it was partly because of that, but more importantly, it was because the superintendent recognized that they didn't have the necessary recovery rooms for people to really kind of recover from that type of a surgery. So it didn't happen on the grounds, but it did happen to some of the patients, because what could happen was a family member could pull their loved one out of the hospital, send them to a neurosurgeon to have a lobotomy, and then once that recovery period was over, have them reinstitutionalized at Central State. The superintendent who made that decision was Max Barr. When he passed away, his successor maintained that, and it never changed. In the 70s, those were kind of going out. Walter Freeman, who had popularized them, was, I think, still trying to travel around with his lobotomy show, trying to kind of gain support for that, but it wasn't as common, and I don't know whether they happen now or not. I suspect they don't. Maybe someone else can answer that.
Well, what I'll do is ask if you do know the answer to that question, to let us know. And while we're doing that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Leah Namias, who has a couple of announcements before we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you guys. The Medical History Museum is like my favorite place in the state of Indiana, so this has been a real treat, Sarah. So I just wanted to give everybody a preview. Normally in May is when we pass out the next season of dates, books, and experts. But we last week, basically at the last minute, changed our mind about a book, and we wanted to read something that was about kind of pandemics to help us think through the moment that we're in. So we made a last minute change. So we're going to send out, and for those who are new or have never been to Books, Brands, and Booze, we take a break in June and we come back July through November. is kind of our fall season, even though it definitely starts in the summer. So we'll be sending out a blast to everyone who has subscribed to the Books, Brains, and Booze newsletter, probably in about 2 weeks with the fall 2020 dates. We'll post those on the Facebook group, and we'll share them across the social media channels. But because one of the things that is hard about this format is we can't really easily collect your email addresses. So, because we don't make you pre-register in advance to attend. So if you would like to make sure you're added to that email list so you get that notification, just if you go to the Books, Brains, and Booze webpage, which is, if you Google Books, Brains, and Booze, you'll find it. You'll see my name there, and you can just email me, and I will make sure you're added to that newsletter list so you get that notification. The second thing is typically we meet in bars, and obviously that's been disrupted. We've been looking into where we want to meet for fall 2020, but it's kind of a moot point because I think we're probably all going to be still doing virtual book clubs in July. We'll wait and see what the governor's plan is, but we'll also take into consideration the best science and public health information, which this is like the one group that you feel really confident will like follow the guidelines. So just kind of stay tuned on both fronts for the new season and for, but the first book I'm really excited about, it's about cannibalism and it's natural history. So woohoo, just what we should be reading to take our minds off of a pandemic. It's about cannibalism. So we will see you. And if you have any questions, again, just shoot an email to me to make sure you're signed up for that mailing list. And we hope we see many of you for the new season.
Please join me in thanking Sarah Halter for being an amazing guest expert. We'd love to have you join us again. Norma, thank you for being here. Like I said, we get kind of a 2-for-1 deal out of this. If you have suggestions for books for the future, as a reminder, yeah, absolutely, I will read. So Leah, do you want to put your email address in the chat box so that folks can grab it? And there it is. So there you go. You can grab it and email Leah. You'll get added to our mailing list. We do not spam you. We will just send you a couple of emails to let you know what the next books are. But thank you all for this really engaging conversation. I hope you guys had great conversations in your breakout rooms. So fun to have you, Sarah. Really enjoyed chatting with you about this book, and we will look forward to seeing everybody back in July. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening. Stay safe. Wash your hands. Wear your mask.
I saw a lot of faces light up at the word cannibalism.
It's a fun group here. We're excited about it.
I think that was the one where I was like, we have to do the cannibalism book. So
yeah,
we are going to champion a book for the season, and so yay.
Yes, yeah, we're really looking for it. I'm really excited about the lineup for this fall. I think it's going to be outstanding, and we have great guest experts as well. So it's going to be lots of fun.
Thanks, Norma. It was also awesome to have you on this call. Like Krista said, it was a twofer. So
it really was. It was great.
I'm gonna go sit in front of a fan and hydrate.
Yeah, take care, Leah. I hope that you get cooled off a little bit.
I know. I'm always like, it can't be like when I lived in New York, I had no central air, so I learned all the cold showers, drink lots of water. Like you'll be fine, but I'm also hopeful my landlord will come fix my air conditioning soon.
I'm too Canadian for this heat.
Oh,
but I also don't like cold. I'm comfortable between like 72 and 74 degrees. Anything below that is too cold. Anything above it is too hot.
That's funny.
I'm only half Canadian, you see.
Yeah.